Well, good morning, everybody. Do you know, I am so grateful to be here this morning using paper notes because I have had, this is turning a testimony, a testing into a testimony. I have had a terrible week. I came downstairs on Tuesday morning to find the downstairs flooded with water, and it has taken days and days to dry it out. But in the meantime, we've had little electricity and no internet. So I'm really grateful to God that he said, no, don't move on to using your tablet and everything, because I wouldn't have been able to sort it out in time. And I've got it on paper today. So praise the Lord. I'm here in one piece and I've got a message to share. Bless you. If you were hoping for a message today from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, I'm afraid we've shuffled things around a bit. I think that might happen next week. And I'm talking on Ephesians 6, verses 5 to 9, on slaves and masters today. And I've entitled this message, Power in Perspective. As we read through this part of Ephesians, we find a lot about making sure our relationships are doing well. Why is that? For instance, we've had a section on husbands and wives, which Pauline brought us last week. And, maybe it's good that our good relationships benefit us and our personal sense of peace, but also it may be not just for our benefit, but for the benefit of people who see us who aren't believers. To non-believers, we're like a mirror image of God and his love for the wider world. So there's another bit in Ephesians chapter 5. It says, be imitators of God, therefore, as beloved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. So there's a sense that we all have a responsibility to imitate how Jesus lived here on this earth, and to show respect to others, whether they have much power or no power. In our passage, it says, there is no favoritism with him. It was pointed out to me just the other day, that when Jesus fed the 5,000, plus, of course, their wives and children, so that might have been nearer 10,000 people that he was feeding in that miracle, that Jesus was actually breaking a Judaic law that said that Jews were not allowed to eat with non-Jews. But in this massive outdoor picnic, everyone was welcome. Everyone. There might have been known sinners there, all sorts of dodgy people, and slaves. And they were all welcome. So when we come to Ephesians chapter 6 in our readings, we might often skip over this bit, verses 5 to 9, about slavery altogether. Or we might think, it's to do with work situations, which is good to do. And we'll talk a bit about work this morning, but we're also going to look at other aspects of this passage. So let's see if this works. My remote control clicker. Ha, great. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you. So when I first started my nurse training, I was on a ward that looked a bit like this. So beds all down the side. At the far end, through those doors, there was the sister's office. Right. It looks quite nice. It looks quite a nice sort of ward like that. But the ward sister was someone who was greatly feared. She never spoke to us student nurses at all. Oh no, she would just come out of her office in that corridor there and bark at us, bark instructions or reprimand us for something with threats. And then she'd go back in the office. How did she know what was going on? Did she have like X-ray eyes through the walls of her office? I don't know. But she was really kind of a scary person. And for those first few months of nurse training, basically I had one main job: to give out bedpans and sick bowls to patients, and then take them away into this little room called the sluice room and wash them out. And that was my main job. And then, if I was really lucky, I could go and do a bit of tidying before the doctor came so that it was all looking beautiful like that, you know, with all the flowers and everything. And that was my role. And during those first few months, I basically learned that I was the lowest of the low on the ward and that I must just do everything I was told. But through reading Ephesians at this time, I did learn this: to aim to serve as if I was serving the Lord, not just because of the ward sister, who was really scary, but because of Jesus. So then fast forward a few years, and I was a fully qualified nurse, and I soon myself rose to the position of ward sister. Ooh. Not only that, I was sometimes left in charge of the entire hospital, like at weekends, bank holidays, when my boss was on holiday, I would be in charge of the hospital. And I had risen from a position of having no power to having quite a lot of power. Do you think I managed the ward like that first ward sister? Hopefully not, indeed. I realised a few things, I learned a few things in the in-between years, that good communication and respect for all staff on the ward, from the cleaners upwards, and sometimes a listening ear, were key elements of being in a place of power. And the thing is that everyone working on the ward and in the hospital, whatever their grade, was a human being and deserved respect, whether their job was quite menial, emptying pans and cleaning toilets, or whether they were highly skilled. But you see, Paul wasn't just talking about our boss and employees at work. Though, of course, we can use this passage to consider these sorts of relationships. In today's passage and in other similar passages written by Paul, such as in Colossians chapter 3, Paul uses the word doulos, which means someone who has become an enslaved person, mostly involuntarily, through force, violence, or even trickery. Now, when Peter writes to slaves in 1 Peter chapter 2, he uses a different word, which is more like a bondservant. But when Paul is speaking, he deliberately uses this word doulos. And doulos is the root of the French word douleur, which means pain, grief, affliction, and suffering. So you see, those ancient Greek slaves who Paul was addressing, they weren't just underdogs at work. They had possibly been captured and forced into slavery, and then perhaps traumatized even more by the treatment they had received, by threats they'd been given. I used to think that slavery in the UK was a thing of the past, because slavery was abolished and made illegal back in the 19th century. So for a long time I thought, well, it doesn't exist here anymore. But I now understand that tragically, modern slavery is on the increase throughout the world, and it is very much here in the UK, even in rural areas like Chesham. How many of you like watching the Olympics? Yeah, that's good. And how many of you remember Mo Farah? Yeah. So Mo Farah was, and still is, a well-celebrated long-distance runner who was born in Somalia, but is now a British citizen and has won many gold medals, especially Olympic gold medals for the UK, and particularly memorable when the Olympics were in the UK in 2012 when he won a whole load of medals. But if you Google him now, you can still watch the 1-hour BBC TV programme in which he reveals the shocking truth about his childhood. How when he was just 4 years old, his father was killed during a war in his country, and how at the age of about 8 or 9, he was sent with an adult who he took to be a distant relative to live a better life in the UK, and how on his arrival in London, he realised that he had been tricked and trapped into a life of slavery. His name was changed, and he was put into forced labour, cooking, cleaning, and looking after the younger children in the family. And eventually, when he was secondary school age, he eventually persuaded the woman who ran the house to let him go to secondary school. He spoke practically no English, his clothes were unkempt, and he was a huge concern to the teachers. It was when he was about 14 that he finally confided in a PE teacher the truth about his home life and situation. And the teacher got social services involved and helped rescue him from that life of slavery. You see, modern slavery is not so far away in this country. I'm understanding as I read about this subject that slavery is now more prevalent than any other crime in the UK. I also read that it's a myth that all enslaved people in this country are foreigners. About 26% of enslaved people in this country are actually British. I've been told that staff in schools and even in nurseries and preschools are now being taught how to look out for vulnerable children and vulnerable parents who might be vulnerable to grooming and drawn into slavery. I'm reading as well that we may even see people quite regularly out in the streets who are actually slaves in our area. It's a crime that goes largely undetected because it can be difficult to spot the signs. So here are some signs that I read from the Neighbourhood Watch website. These people that we might come across have very limited social contact or contact with their family. They might not have any identification because someone else has it. They'd be unlikely to have much or any money despite working long hours, and they would probably be unable to move around freely without permission from somewhere else. Now, the Neighbourhood Watch gives a lot of advice, and it's well worth looking at it because, we all live in a neighbourhood. They give advice on what to do if you encounter someone who you think might be enslaved. They say, don't go and try and talk to that person yourself about it, because it may cause trouble for them or for you. But gather as much information as you can, for instance, car registrations, addresses, and dates. And then perhaps go to the police, or you might want to go to a safeguarding officer within the church, especially if they're linked to the church. I'm looking at Sally. But Sally and Peter are our safeguarding officers, and it might be worth going and asking their advice as well. You see, we're given this insight from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 6, which I'll put up again later. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the cords of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every yoke. If you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then the Lord will satisfy your needs. Compared to the rest of the world, we are a pretty wealthy country. I'm not saying super wealthy, but we are a pretty wealthy country, and we live fairly privileged lives. We might complain about the state of the roads, or the long wait to see a GP, or the banks and the libraries closing. But many of us here own a car and drive on those roads. We do have a free NHS doctor, even if there might be a long wait to see them. We mainly have enough money to buy a bit of food, and we can access books and education. So on the whole, compared to the developing world, we have spending power. We are people with power. We're not VIPs, very important people, but we are PWPs. We are people with power. Oh, come on. Yeah, there we go. In the developing world, we're regarded as people with power, PWPs. You see in this slide, in the top left-hand corner, there's a gentleman reaching out to shake my hand, and he does it like this. Not with a remote. He does it like this, which is a sign of deep respect. He's saying, I really respect you. And you'll see the bottom right, that's how many of the people in the rural areas live. They have a little house and they grow their crops. And see, if they grow their crops and they do well, they're okay. If those crops fail, they are going to starve. And the only way they're not going to starve is if they find a job that will give them a little bit of money to buy food to feed their families. So they may well end up working long hours for someone else for very little money just to live. This might seem irrelevant to our lives here in Chesham, because in the 21st century, we are part of a global economy. Our country relies on other countries around the world for the stuff we want. And because of that, we're part of the global community. Most of you will be aware that Chesham is a fair trade town, in which we're encouraged to buy stuff that has been fairly traded. But, when you're going shopping, what is the difference between something that's been fairly traded and something that's not? Does it make any difference? It doesn't really make that much difference to us. We might not notice the difference at our end of the chain, though. But our choices can make a huge difference to other people at the other end of the chain, where they are struggling in poverty. So it's good to ask these sorts of questions. Where does the item you're buying come from? Who grew it or made it? So take tea, coffee, chocolate, and cotton. These are often grown in poor rural communities in the developing world. How are the farmers being treated? Are they being paid fairly? Are children being used as unpaid labour, which is slavery? Or are they able to go to school? We belong to one of the richer countries in the world. We are PWPs, and we can choose how we spend our money. Are we happy to fund firms who pay people really poorly, what they call sweatshop labour, to make our clothes? In this era of internet connection, it is possible to check out where a lot of our stuff comes from. Our money can speak if we refuse to buy things from firms that allow slavery to happen in developing countries. Interestingly, I heard just yesterday that Marks and Spencer's are now working really hard to produce quality products that have not been made by people who are being treated poorly. They're trying to improve the standards of the people at the other end of the chain. So if a product has a fair trade logo on it, you're okay. Sometimes the label on the product will tell you something about the workers. And cotton clothing may have a sign on it saying GOTS. That stands for Global Organic Textile Standard, which means better standards for the workers. You may get an idea of the ethics of a website from looking at it and just seeing what they say about standards. Chocolate. What about chocolate? We all love chocolate, don't we? See, there's fair trade chocolate, which I haven't put up there. They've got a fair trade logo on. You can buy fair trade chocolate. But there's only one very small chocolate company that isn't under the fair trade logo that is campaigning against the use of unpaid child labour in farming of cocoa beans for our chocolate. And that one firm is Tony's Chocolonely. Yeah? Come across them? Yeah. So if you buy that, you know that you're doing a good thing, whereas there are some brands that really don't care what happens at the other end of the chain. How about our phones? I get reminders every couple of years that I need to upgrade my phone now. Well, I went and inquired about this, for my phone anyway. And having inquired, I discovered that I don't need to upgrade quite as soon as they say, and I've actually hung on to my phone now for about 8 years. There's a reason why I prefer to hang on to my phone as long as I can. Because there are children mining for these really rare minerals, including cobalt, which is needed for our phones and computers. And the technology has not advanced enough for the world not to need cobalt and these rare minerals. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the very, very few, if not the only country in the world that has enough cobalt and these rare minerals to supply our phones and also our laptops. So I'm hanging on to my phone for a bit longer because every time I think about children mining in really unsafe conditions like that, I just think, no, I'll hang on a bit longer, I'll hang on a bit longer. I'm rushing through this because time is short. But I wanted to just mention another group of people who may find themselves trapped in a life of slavery, violence, and threats. And these are girls and young women living in developing countries. You see, however high achieving a girl may be in a developing country, her family might stop her from going to school when she reaches puberty simply because they cannot afford to buy her sanitary products. And not only that, at that point, her family will often force her into a marriage and a life of slavery. If that grips you, then do come and speak to me afterwards, because this is something that we can help to prevent. There are girls there who are just desperate to learn, to be able to go to school, and they're desperate to have help with their sanitary products so that they can stay at school. So, in conclusion, we are people with power. We can keep watch on our area for vulnerable people. Are they being exploited? Look at the Neighbourhood Watch website, or speak to somebody at church, one of the safeguarding officers, and see what they think. Treat vulnerable people with dignity and respect. God does not show favoritism. Think before we buy. Do we need this item? And maybe we can buy less. Ask, where was it grown and harvested? Are the farmers treated well? Look for a fair trade logo on products. Look for a GOTS label on cotton clothing. and maybe wait another year before upgrading your phone. These are just some suggestions to help us to relieve people from a life of slavery. So I'm just going to go back to that, Isaiah chapter 58. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the cords of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke and set the oppressed free, and break every yoke. If we spend ourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then the Lord will satisfy our needs. Amen.